Good evening and welcome. I'm honored, pleased, and happy to open the last event of the second day in our Poetry Place International Festival. We are celebrating the International Poetry Day, which was yesterday. My name is Gilad Meiri, and I'm part of the literary committee of the festival with Atara Ben Hanan and with Noah Shakarji. I'm happy to introduce Hava Pinhas-Cohen, who is an award-winning poetess, a translator of poetry, and an editor. Hava will host this show, and she will shortly present Robert Pinsky. But just before we begin, some technical issues. Your microphone will be muted during the event, but we may dedicate the last few minutes, maybe 10 minutes or so, to your questions that you may write us in the chat box. And now I pass the mic to you, Hava, and I wish us a very pleasant event.
Erev Tov. Good evening. Well, I'll introduce Robert Pinsky in Hebrew, because for him it's not news. And then we will go for a reading. רוברט פינסקי, השנה הוא בן 81, הוא יליד 1940, אוקטובר 1940. הוא סופר, משורר ומתרגם, נולד וגדל בלונג ברנץ', ניו ג'רסי, ולמד לתואר ראשון באוניברסיטת רטגרס, והמשיך ללימודים מתקדמים באוניברסיטת סטנפורד. כל השמות האלה מאוד חשובים, משום שהם כמו איזו ערוגה שממנה הוא מתפתח ויוצר את קהילת המשוררים שלו. רוברט גדל במשפחה יהודית, אפשר אפילו לומר, הוא כותב באוטוביוגרפיה חדשה שעומדת לצאת לאור שנה הבאה, שזו משפחה אפילו יהודית אורתודוקסית, אבל לפחות למראית עין, מבחינת ההתנהגות שלה. הדברים האלה משפיעים על כתיבתו, כן או לא, זה מעניין מאוד, ואני מקווה שגם נוכל לפתח את זה בשיחה שלנו. אחד הדברים שבהם הוא התפרסם מאוד, זה מפעל גדול שלו, של קריאת שירה, לאהוב שירה. זה מפעל שבו הוא מזמין אנשים פשוטים, אנשים מכל גווני החברה, להביא שיר שהם אוהבים, לקרוא אותו בקולם, מצולמים, וזה מצטרף לאתר גדול שהוא פיתח. מתי הוא פיתח את זה? הוא פיתח את זה במשך 3 שנים, שבהן הוא היה משורר הקונגרס בארצות הברית. הוא אחד האנשים, אני חושבת שהוא המשורר היחיד, שזכה לתואר הזה ברציפות 3 פעמים, בדרך כלל משורר מקבל, אם הוא מגיע למעמד הזה, הוא מקבל את זה לשנה אחת. אז זה אומר משהו עליו, על הדרך ההתקבלות שלו, ועל המקום החשוב שלו בתוך השירה האמריקאית. ואת שאר הדברים הביוגרפיים אני אשתדל לגלות תוך כדי השיחה איתו. אבל זאת המסגרת. אותי הוא מסקרן מאוד בין השאר, בגלל התכנים של השירים שלו, שיש בהם משהו מאוד חברתי, מאוד עם עין בוחנת, רגישה, לעוולות, למקומו של האדם השקוף, האדם שבשולי החברה, הוא לוחד אותו במבט ומביא אותו למרכז דרך השירה. אז אנחנו יכולים להתחיל בקריאת שירה, נתחיל באנגלית, נעבור לעברית, אני מבקשת את 3 שירים הראשונים. So Robert, I just introduce you, and it will be wonderful if we can start reading, and if you can start with biography, your poem biography.
I'll be glad to. I'm honored and pleased to be here, grateful to Gilad and Atara, and certainly to Hava for the translations and the hospitality to all of you. So here's a poem, maybe a good place to start with biography. Biography. Stone wheel that sharpens the blade that mows the grain. Wheel of the sunflower turning. Wheel that turns the spiral press that squeezes the oil expressed from grain or olives. Particles turned to mud on the potter's wheel that whirls to form the vessel that holds the oil that drips to cool the blade. My mother's dreadful fall, her mother's dread of all things, death, life, birth. My mother's birth just before the fall, my brother's birth before that fall, his birth again in Jesus, wobble and blur of my soul, born just once, that cleaves to circles, the moon, the eye, the year, circle of causes or chaos or turns of chance. Line of a tune as it circles back to the root. Arc of the changes. The line from there to here of Ellen speaking. The line of the circle of friends. The art of lines. A chord of the circle of work. Radius. Lives of my children growing away. The plant radiant in air, its root in dark.
ביוגרפיה. אבן גלגל אשר משחיזה את הלאו הקוצר את התבואה. גלגל, חמניה, מסתובב, גלגל המסובב את ציר הלחץ שסוחט את השמן הנובע מתבואה או זיתים, חלקיקים שהפכו לבוץ, על אובניים מסתחררים ליצירת הכלי שהתמלא בשמן המטפטף לצינון הלאו. הנפילה האיומה של אמי, האימה של אמה, מכל הדברים, מוות, חיים, לידה, הלידה של אחי, רגע לפני הנפילה, לידתו שוב בישו. נענוע ערפול נשמתי, נולד רק פעם אחת, שנצמדה למעגלים, הלבנה, העין, השנה, מעגלים של סיבות אותו או תפניות מקריות של סיכוי. תו של ניגון הסב לשורשו, קשת שינויים, קו הדיבור של אלן, משם לכאן, חוט של מעגל חברי, אומנות הקווים, מיתר מעגל עבודה, רדיוס, חיי ילדים הצומחים מכאן, הצמח המבריק באוויר, שורשו באפלה. Then I'll ask you to read Samurai Song.
All right. I hope biography didn't disappoint people who were hoping that I would name names and tell stories. The circle feels like my biography. And thank you, Hava Pinhas-Cohen, for the translation, for reading it. Samurai Song. When I had no roof, I made audacity my roof. When I had no supper, my eyes dined. When I had no eyes, I listened. When I had no ears, I thought. When I had no thought, I waited. When I had no father, I made care my father. When I had no mother, I embraced order. When I had no friend, I made quiet my friend. When I had no enemy, I opposed my body. When I had no temple, I made my voice my temple. I have no priest. My tongue is my choir. When I have no means, fortune is my means. When I have nothing, death will be my fortune. Need is my tactic. Detachment is my strategy. When I had no lover, I courted my sleep.
שיר סמוראי. כאשר לא היה גג, עשיתי את החוצפה לגג שלי. כאשר לא הייתה לי ארוחה, אכלו עיניי. כאשר לא היו לי עיניים, הקשבתי. כאשר לא היו לי אוזניים, הרהרתי. כאשר לא הייתה לי מחשבה, חיכיתי. כאשר לא היה לי אבא, עשיתי את הדאגה לאב. כאשר לא הייתה לי אם, חיבקתי סדר. כאשר לא היה לי חבר, עשיתי את השקט חבר. כאשר לא היה לי אויב, התנגדתי לגופי. כאשר לא היה לי מקדש, עשיתי את קולי מקדשי. אין לי כהן, לשוני היא המקהלה שלי. כאשר אין לי אמצעים, גורלי הוא האמצעי שלי. כאשר אין לי דבר, מוות יהיה אושרי. צורך הוא הטקטיקה שלי, ניתוק הוא האסטרטגיה שלי. כאשר לא היה לי אהוב, חיזרתי אחר שנתי. Well, I picked up those two poems to begin with because I think they are representing something, and if I'm not wrong, they were translated to so many languages, so it says something. I would like to connect the poem about that you call it biography with your own biography. And there is something that I didn't have the guts before to ask you, but now after I read some of your last interviews, and I would like to ask you about your mother. There is a story that is in your poem about your mother, something about her, and even in Samurai, there is you mentioned her in a very special way. Can you tell something about her, about your childhood?
Yes. It occurs to me that my poem biography, in this context of being here, so to speak, in Israel, it's a rather Jewish biography, and my samurai is a rather Jewish samurai. He's a samurai who describes his independence and disaffiliation by naming all the possible human relations there are. Not this and not this and not that, which is a way of saying this and this and that. And biography, in a way, says, but I'm not going to tell the story of my biography. And then it does it in this sort of circumnavigation way. My mother was a brilliant verbal person. She and my father went to the same high school as me in New Jersey. It was what you would have to call a lower middle class or working class family. They were very verbal, very funny. And a big event in our life as a family was her terrible brain injury. She had symptoms of a concussion for many years. Light and sound were hurtful to her. And the brother, I make the joke in that poem biography that I'm the only son my parents had to be born only once. That little baby, they were looking at a model home. They couldn't afford to buy a house, but they kept looking. And she handed the infant to my father. The rest of my sister, they were all there. I was too gloomy. I was home playing the piano. Mm-hmm. She handed the baby to my father, and she stepped out in the attic. It turns out she stepped out onto insulation, not onto a floor. And on the way down, she banged her head on a joist. So for years, dominating the family was this terrible fall. And it, of course, had a big impact on all of our lives. She very slowly got better. And I recently have written about how she and I had, during that period, we traded science fiction. I was 11 or 12 years old, and she had a soldier at Fort Monmouth who would give her a carton of science fiction books. She would give her old ones to him. And we had that in common. Didn't have big conversations, but, oh, that's a good one, or I like it. And there's a line in a poem I love by the English poet Fulk Greville where he says, "Absence, my presence is. Strangeness, my grace. Absence, my presence is." And my mother's absence from many of the normal things of life was a terrific presence in the lives of the family. So we had one brother who tried being born again and Jesus, and we had another brother who hid in music and poetry.
There were signs of Jewishness in your family?
We were a kosher household. We went to an Orthodox shul. When you were reading my poems, I know the characters well enough to follow a lot of it phonetically. Her mother and father lived a few doors away from us. So, and my mother didn't cook. So we got sent over from my grandmother, all kinds of things, beautiful challahs she made. But the typical, would be a lakshin kogo or something. And my father's father was a gangster, was not very religious. He was a bootlegger. So the family was in a way Jewish. We were nominally Orthodox. If you read Franz Kafka's journals of his own growing up in Vienna or Prague, he grew up very similar, where you go to the shul on high holidays and you go through certain motions. And for example, this mother who had a concussion, I think it was before the concussion, it was maybe 9 years old. We had a strict kosher household, different set of things for Pesach. And she took me to the Woolworths lunch counter to have a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich so that I would not be naive, so I would be a sophisticated person.
Oh, that's a good way to raise a child.
And, it was a typical characteristic compromise that Jews make with a largely Christianized culture. I wonder if young Israelis even can understand how the English language, the architecture, the music, the calendar, all kinds of things are Christian. Not in a malign way. It's not that they're tormenting you. It's just that's what is there. So then each generation has to find a compromise. And my poem Samurai Song and my poem Biography, I think of as part of that cultural compromise that in many countries on the earth are part of a Jewish destiny.
That was a sentence that I will quote.
Yeah.
Yeah, this kind of Jewish compromise.
Yeah, it's so like my poems, the answer I gave you was an attempt to be as candid and objective as I can about a mainspring of my life and of the lives of many people.
Yeah. Can you tell me how it happened that this samurai song became so popular and well known, when I translated it, I was fascinated because of powerful something about. I felt like it's so emotional, but in one way it's so emotional. On the other hand, it's like holding its own power in its words.
Yeah, hard to explain these things. As you say, I've heard it. I've heard it in Chinese. I've heard it in Italian. I think a very powerful word in any language is no. And in a poem, to say no ears or ears, an elephant or no elephant, in a legal contract, it's a big difference. In a poem, it means almost the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I had no father, and to say I had a father. In a scientific document or a legal brief, they're the opposite. In a poem, it's almost the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was partly imitating a Japanese poem I had heard in translation, but without thinking about it, I fell under the spell of negation. In a way, I didn't know I was going to hold this together, but I said to you, absence my presence is.
Yeah.
This goes back to what I understand to be in Christianity, the Thomist or Augustinian doctrine that evil is absence. Dark is not a force, it's an absence of light energy. Heat,
Mm-hmm.
Heat is an absence of, cold is an absence of heat energy. Forgive me, cold is an absence of heat energy. And I don't know Talmud, but I'm told that in the Talmud, it says that for most people, I think it's true for me, the evil that other people do to us, the wounds that other people give us, are like nothing compared to the things we do to ourselves. And I relate that to this idea of negation or nothing, that you diminish yourself, and we can't help doing it. We do it repeatedly over and over again. We give ourselves some wound where there's a little bit less soul there, a little bit more absence. And it's one of the great incomprehensible truths is that we choose to be less. And I've wasted my life trying to understand it.
Yeah, and I think you are one of the biggest teachers for poetry. I don't know, it's the way you are dealing with poetry. It's it gives me tools to understand or how to be a better teacher or how to spread this love of poetry. It's you are a master in this.
I appreciate it so much, Hava. I am not being falsely modest. I'm talking to you from the heart when I say, I appreciate your saying it. I don't feel it. What I feel is I have a knack at fitting the sounds of words together.
Okay.
When I say neck, I'm aware that k goes in the back of my mouth and is sort of in my nose. And I think I can have a knack, I hope. And hope inside out, I have hope of Pope, Po. That is the only thing I know I can do. And if it turns out that you say I say things that are useful, I'm thrilled by it. I'm very pleased. But since truly, I can't completely believe that. Unless I
I'm
can
not
really
saying, I'm saying by senses.
It's not real.
No, I'm saying that you give kind of, it's more about senses than logic and something that comes from my mind. It's about body and senses and the feeling of words and the way words are performing in the world. But then I'll move further and we will ask you something about your big project, your big project that I'm amazed by, and this is the favorite poem project that you initiated, and it's still going on. Can you tell us about, especially in a place for poetry that it's a kind of school for poetry, and there are many poets around, maybe one of them will take this idea to the Hebrew poetry. I don't know.
I hope that anybody can hear what we're saying. Hava will go to favorite poem, not poems, not poet, favoritepoem.org, and see the videos.
Yeah.
You'll see a construction worker reading Whitman. You will see a Cambodian American immigrant read Langston Hughes. You will see a Jamaican immigrant reading Sylvia Plath. And I can't comment on Israel in the relation of social class to art. But the United States, we have to take care of art, and in some way we invent. We don't have two of the traditional sources of art. One, I suppose, an example would be Yiddishkeit. That is a folk culture.
Yeah.
Single folk culture where the grandfather and the grandmother pass on poetry, music, along with the jokes and the recipes. In the United States, the Cambodian grandmother and the African grandmother and the Jewish, if they're so lucky as to live near the grandchildren, they all have different things they pass on. In some cultures, I think especially Eastern European, also Asian, art that relies on a very high social class. It has snob value. You know, in Russia, they yell at one another, you have no culture. It's not an American insult.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to invent. We have to invent a way to recognize art, and everybody loves poetry. It's like dancing or singing. It's physical. If you were taking care of a baby, you can sing to the baby. I've learned you can recite to the baby. Baby responds the same way. But it's like when people say, oh, I can't dance. You're at a wedding, no, I don't know how to dance. When you were 3 years old, you did. The music starts and you start moving around. And the favorite poem project applies that principle to poetry. We did not tell people, oh, poetry is good for you, you should have it, or here's a wonderful poem. We asked people, is there a poem you love? And lo and behold, there are all these tens and thousands of Americans who say, oh, I love this poem by Wallace Stevens. Oh, Emily Dickinson. Some in foreign languages, not as much, but we had Rimbaud, Pablo Neruda. Not always an immigrant, not always somebody who that's their native language. And it turns out there is such a thing as a democratic culture, but we're still making it up as we go along.
Yeah.
And, it's not nearly as good for me to be talking to you about it, Hava, as for people to go look at some of the videos at favoritepoem.org.
That's what I wanted. I wanted to
we just added the chef.
This door.
Yeah,
that's what I wanted. I wanted to open this door and to introduce who did it, who had this wonderful idea.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you if you can read now the shirt.
Shirt, the back, the yoke, the yardage, lapped seams, the nearly invisible stitches along the collar turned in a sweatshop by Koreans or Malaysians gossiping over tea and noodles on their break, or talking money or politics, while one fitted this arm piece with its overseam to the band of cuff eye button at my wrist. The presser, the cutter, the wringer, the mangle, the needle, the union, the treadle, the bobbin, the code. The infamous blaze at the Triangle Factory in 1911. 146 died in the flames on the 9th floor. No hydrants, no fire escapes. The witness in a building across the street who watched how a young man helped a girl to step up to the windowsill, then held her out away from the masonry wall and let her drop. And then another, as if he were helping them up to enter a streetcar and not eternity. A third, before he dropped her, put her arms around his neck and kissed him. Then he held her into space and dropped her. Almost at once, he stepped to the sill himself. His jacket flared and fluttered up from his shirt as he came down, air filling up the legs of his gray trousers. Like Hart Crane's Bedlamite, shrill shirt ballooning. Wonderful how the pattern matches perfectly across the bar-tacked corners of both pockets and over the placket, like a strict rhyme or a major chord. Prints, plaids, checks, houndstooth, tattersall, madras, the clan tartans invented by mill owners inspired by the hoax of Ashen to control their savage Scottish workers, tamed by a fabricated heraldry. McGregor, Bailey, McMartin, the kilt devised for workers to wear among the dusty clattering looms. Weavers, carders, spinners, the loader, the docker, the navvy, the planter, the picker, the sorter sweating at her machine in the litter of cotton as slaves in calico head rags sweated in fields. George Herbert, your descendant is a black lady in South Carolina. Her name is Irma, and she inspected my shirt. Its color and fit and feel and its clean smell have satisfied both her and me. We have culled its cost and quality down to the buttons of simulated bone, the buttonholes, the sizing, the facing, the characters printed in black on neckband and tail, the shape, the label, the labor, the color, the shade, the shirt.
וואו. החולצה, הגב, הכתפיים, מטראז' הבד, חיבורים חופפים, התפרים הכמעט בלתי נראים לאורך הצווארון שקופל במתפרת מיזה של קוריאנים או מלזים, שמרחלים בהפסקה תוך כדי תה ויטריות, או מדברים על כסף או פוליטיקה, ואחד מהם התאים את השרוול הזה עם התפר לדש. החפת שאני מחפתר על פרק כף ידי, המגהץ, הגוזר, המסחטה, המעגילה, המחט, האיגוד, הדוושה, הסליל, החוק, השריפה הארורה, בבית חרושת המשולש, ב-1911, 146 נספו בלהבות, בקומה התשיעית, ללא ברזי כיבוי, ללא יציאת חירום. העד בבניין שמעבר לרחוב, שצפה איך איש צעיר עזר לנערה לטפס לעדן החלון, הושיט אותה הרחק מחוץ לקיר לבנים, שמט אותה מטה, ואחר כך עוד אחת, כאילו היה עוזר להן להיכנס לתוך קרון חשמלית ולא לעבר הנצח. השלישית, לפני ששחרר אותה, קרחה זרועותיה סביב צווארו ונשקה אותו. אז אחז בה, ושמט אותה אל תוך החלל. כמעט באחת, הוא עלה אל עדן החלון בעצמו. המקטורן שלו התעופף מחולצתו, וכאשר נפל מטה, ואוויר ניפח את שרוולי מכנסיו האפורים, כמו המשוגע אצל הארט קריין, חולצה צרכנית מתנפחת. זה נפלא, איך הדוגמה תואמת בשלמות את רוחב הכיס ומעל פס תואם. פינות שני הכיסים, כמו חריזה קפדנית, או אקורד מז'ורי, הדפסים, שתי וערב, משבצות, ריבועים, נקודות, טלאים, בדי כותנה, דגמי שבטי הסקוטיים, שהומצאו על ידי בעלי מפעל שקיבלו השראה מתרמית זיוף האוסיאן, כדי לשלוט על העובדים הסקוטיים הפיריים, שהולפו על ידי סמלי שבטים מפוברקים, מקגרגור, ביילי, מקמרטין. החצאית הסקוטית שהומצאה עבור העובדים כדי שילבשו אותה בין הנולים המאובקים והמרעישים. אורגים, טובים, סורגים, המעמיס, הסבר, פועל שחור, הנוטע, הקוטף, הממיינת, המזיעה ליד המכונה שלה עם פסולת כותנה, כמו שפחות עם סמרטוט מבת כותנה בלוי שהזיעו בשדות. ג'ורג' הרברט, הצאצאית שלך היא גברת שחורה מדרום קרוליינה, שמה הוא אירמה, והיא פיקחה על החולצה שלי, מהצבע והגזרה והמרקם שלה. הריח הנקי, ושנינו היינו מרוצים, היא וגם אני. בחנו את המחיר והאיכות שלה, עד לכפתורי העצם המלאכותית. לולאות הכפתורים, הסידור, הגימור, האותיות, מודפסות בשחור על דש הצווארון והכנף מאחור, הצורה, התג, המלאכה, הצבע, הגוון, החולצה. Well, I read this poem so many times, and each time it looks to me like it's a movie. It says so lot of motion, and it's unforgettable, this poem and these pictures that it made. And I wanted to know what was the inspiration for this poem, and also if I had this feeling that this poem has the power to change something, the way we look at things. I don't know, that's my feeling. I don't know if you got such reactions from other readers.
Thank you very much, Hava. I'll try to be useful and concise. A poem, maybe more than other arts, a poem you've been working on all your life. So that even if you write it very quickly, you write it in 10 minutes or half an hour, you've been working on it for years. And you may be feeling in the dark for the poem that you've been working on for years, and you're in another part of the room. I started writing a poem about an artist. I imagine this artist, when she was young, her mother worked doing piecework on a sewing machine. They were very poor. And the beautiful treadle sewing machine had these beautiful wrought iron black treadle and the beautiful gilt shiruguskes on the arm, which is almost like a human arm. And her work as a sculptor combines black metal and wood. And I don't know if it was before or after I was working on that poem, not very satisfied with what I had. I read the English left-wing historian's book, Hobsbawm's book, The Invention of Tradition, where he says that things that are presented as ancient are really not ancient, or they're so mythologized, like the scepter and the crown and the jewels when we have a new monarch in England. It's not ancient. The ritual is innate. It's all recently invented and devised. Mm-hmm. And he has a chapter on the kilt. This is the kilt was worn by Highland Scots who were considered animals by the English and the Lowland Scots. They conquered them, they put them to work in the mills, and they were accustomed, Highland Scots wore these woolen robes, bathrobes. And when these animals worked in the mill, as they were taught to do, sometimes a robe would get caught in the machinery and you would lose hours of work getting the body parts out. So they gave them miniskirts. And then according to Hobsbawm, the Prince of Wales likes the way they look and he has a regiment that wears them. I was very aware that immigrant groups in the United States, the Jews, the Italians, then later the Chinese, the Cambodians, the Koreans, the two kinds of labor that immigrant groups often do. I mean, there's agriculture, but the rag trade, as the slang has it, the garment business. And while I had the Hobsbawm in my mind and the poem about the artist, I was living in San Francisco and I read a story about sweatshops in San Francisco. In San Francisco, this is in the 1980s. And people are trapped in these basements with no ventilation and very bad pay. And it's Asian people. And it's part of the way immigrants try to make themselves useful to earn their bread in the country. And the famous Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, it's now an NYU building on the site. We passed laws. It was just in time for photographs. 1911 photographs could be sent to newspapers. She saw the cop standing on the sidewalk, and there are these bodies of basically children, teenage girls, Jewish, Italian, and the photographs are so shocking, we passed laws about workplace safety, child labor, and et cetera. But then on the other hand, I read about sweatshops in the newspaper. So this goes back to the circle of biography. Does it change, or does it change very in a painful spiral, not right up, but going around in those circles? So the poem evolved out of all of these tributary streams in my life. Mm-hmm. I knew that, okay, my father's father was a gangster and a bootlegger, but most of his contemporary Jews were to do with garments of one kind or another. And certainly he and my parents, they're very beautiful people. My father never let us forget, he was voted in his high school graduating class, best looking boy. He was a basketball player, and a sports writer called him the Adonis of the courts. And they loved clothes. They liked to look good. And so there's that tributary.
But there is a story behind these clothes.
Yes, and every one, there's a reason. And people have asked me, did you do research for the call, the placket, this is a placket, and the yoke? And I said, no. I grew up in a poor Jewish family that loved clothes. And if we went into some discount chain like S. Klein's on the square in Union Square in New York, he said, oh, that's a nice one with the placket. So I knew this terminology. I'm a straight man who likes to shop.
I wonder if something was changed since 1911 and so on, since these sweatshops, and if we are in a new era, or we are still looking around us and see the same Koreans, the same immigrants?
I wish I was able to answer the question, but every so often there's a scandal about everybody wears the Nike sneakers, and there's a scandal where it turns out, well, there's some place in Asia where child labor makes these Nike sneakers. That we buy them, we spend $100 on the sneakers, and somebody makes a lot of money on them, and the children are making maybe $1 an hour, long hours to make the sneakers, like our cell phones. So if you look at it in the global scale, it's beyond me. I'll retreat again, Hava, to all I know about is the syllables and the vowels and the consonants and the way they sound. And then I try to be true to my feeling, my passion, which includes passion about politics, life, all sorts of things, but not to pretend I am a great seer or a great knower. I have to be true.
But
I have to be true to my uncertainty also.
But you know, we are in an era where the most powerful poems are confessions. And here you gave these poems, and especially Shirt, is about looking outside at the other people and seeing the pain of others, and being part of something, you know, human being, a community, people to people, whatever. And maybe this is one of the reasons I loved to translate these poems, because there is not only about me, but the way I see is also about me. It's a kind of different circle.
Thank you. Yes. I know about right. It's about a shirt, and I say my shirt, my wrist, but I know how the fire is about me. Whether the reader knows it or not, it's also my fire.
Yeah, well, something that I'm taking with me, you know, as reader and translator, because I had to get into and to see this scene, and it was for me like a movie, you know, that you are in and out. And I would like to ask you to read now. It's a continuation of our a very special poem that, if you would like, even before you read, to tell something about this poem. It's a long poem, but very special. Ahavat Mavet in Hebrew, a love of death.
Do we have time for it?
I think so.
Okay. I wrote a book about the country called An Explanation of America. It's addressed to a child. And there are sections of the poem that think about the possibility of fascism in the United States. I'm sad to say, I don't want to be a prophet, but at the time I had a friend of mine recently remembered him saying to me that Robert, it's not realistic. The United States has many things wrong that there won't be fascism. And he said, now in recent history, it's clear that it is a possibility. And I associate it with the odd romance of death, you know, our cowboy movies, our noir, but also with the mysticism about landscape, almost empty landscape. And when the fascists were rallying in Charlottesville, Virginia, they were using the old European blood and soil. And it seemed absolutely an anachronism, and yet there it was. So this section of An Explanation of America, it quotes Willa Cather, the great, great American writer about the plains in the Midwest, but it tries to imagine how the big, wide, empty spaces that were not literally empty, there were various Indian nations living there, how that mysticism of the prairie in particular is related to an anti-rational, an emotional, land-based, emptiness-based feeling.
Can I ask you something, Robert? Yeah. Just a moment. I would like to say a few words in Hebrew before you are reading. Is it okay?
Of course, Hava.
אני פונה אליכם עכשיו, לא אליו. אני מרגישה שקורה משהו שכאילו אני נשמעת אפילו אליו כמי שמחניפה לו, וזה לא ממש בא לי. אני רוצה לציין כאן משהו שאני חושבת שרוברט פינסקי עושה, שהוא עשה את זה במשך שנים רבות, אבל בעידן שלנו זה לא הבון טון. האחד זה הרגישות החברתית שלו, והוא כותב הרבה מאוד על דמויות שהוא רואה ודרכן הוא חושף את רגשותיו, דעתו וכן הלאה, אבל דרך הדמויות האחרות. ובמקרה הזה של אהבת מוות זה שיר עם עוצמה פוליטית יוצאת מן הכלל ואמיצה מאוד, שלכאורה מסתתרת מאחורי איזה מרחב פואטי גדול, זו בעצם כמעט פואמה. ואני פשוט רוצה להסב את תשומת לבכם לעניין הזה. הקריאה, תשימו לב לריתמוס. הריתמוס פה מאוד 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 חשוב. זו נשימה ארוכה, בדיוק כמו הערבות הגדולות של אמריקה. ואני פשוט רוצה לכוון לאותם דברים שיש כאילו מה לשאוב מהם, או מה להשוות גם בתקופה שאנחנו חיים ובשירה שאנחנו חיים. אז עברתי לעברית ואני מקווה שזה יאמר משהו. כלומר, זה קשה לי לדבר איתו בסופרלטיבים, כי אני נותנת לו כאילו ציונים או לא יודעת מה, אבל יש כאן משהו שהוא יוצא דופן ועוצמתי, שהייתי רוצה מאוד לחלוק איתכם. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Hava. A love of death from An Explanation of America. Imagine a child from Virginia or New Hampshire alone on the prairie 80 years ago or more one afternoon, the shaggy pelt of grasses. For the first time in that child's life, flowing for miles. Imagine the moving shadow of a cloud far off across that shadeless ocean, the obliterating strangeness like a tide that pulls or empties the bubble of the child's imaginary heart. No hills, no trees. The child's heart lightens, tending like a bubble towards the currents of the grass and sky, the pure potential of the clear, blank spaces. Or imagine the child in a drawer that holds a garden cupped from the limitless motion of the prairie, head resting against a pumpkin in evening sun. Ground cherry bushes grow along the furrows, the fruit red under its papery, moth-shaped sheath. Grasshoppers tumble among the vines, as large as dragons in the crumbs of pale, dry earth. The ground is warm to the child's cheek, and the wind is a humming sound in the grass above the draw. Rippling the shadows of the red-green blades. The bubble of the child's heart melts a little, because the quiet of that air and earth is like the shadow of a peaceful death. Limitless, potential, a kind of space where one dissolves to become a part of something entire, whether of sun and air or goodness and knowledge. It does not matter to the child. Dissolved among the particles of the garden or into the motion of the grass and air. Imagine the child happy to be a thing. Imagine then that on that same wide prairie, some people are threshing in the terrible heat with horses and machines, cutting bands and shoveling amid the clatter of the threshers, the chaff in prickly clouds and the naked sun burning as if it could set the chaff on fire. Imagine that the people are Swedes or Germans, some of them resting pressed against the straw stacks, trying to get the meager shade. A man, a tramp, comes laboring across the stubble like a mirage against that blank horizon, laboring in his torn shoes toward the tall, mirage-like images of the tilted threshers clattering in the heat. Because the Swedes or Germans have no beer, or else because they cannot speak his language properly, or for some reason one cannot imagine. The man climbs up on a thresher and cuts bands a minute or two, and then waves to one of the people, a young girl or a child, and jumps head first into the sucking mouth of the machine, where he is wedged and beat and cut to pieces, while the people shout and run in the clouds of chaff, like lost mirages on the pelt of prairie.
You want to stop here?
I did stop there, yes.
Okay.
I thought maybe that was enough.
Okay. So,
okay, I'll read
you read the whole poem in English, and I
left out 4 lines. I'm sorry. Mental fate. The obliterating strangeness and the spaces are as hard to imagine as the love of death, which is the love of an entire strangeness, the contagious blankness of a quiet plain. Sorry about that, and thank you.
Thank you so much. I will not read in Hebrew because it's so easy to read. And I would like to continue towards the new poems that you've sent me. One is Being a Ghost, and the other is... אנחנו סיימנו?
Not הסוף. We're just... we have a few more minutes, and maybe we can answer some questions from the people who sent them in the chat box. And
good.
Okay.
Fine with me.
Alex, you had an interesting question. Atarao, you can maybe let Alex ask the question, you know, unmute him.
You need to unmute yourself. I invited you to do so. Here.
Hello, hi everyone. Hello, Mr. Pinsky.
Hello, hello, Alex.
It was very good to hear you. Thank you very much for the reading and the talk.
Thanks, my pleasure.
I wanted to ask, as someone who has apparently a very wide perspective on American poetry, I'm just curious about how you see it today. Where is it going? Where is it at? and what are the dominant things that are happening right now with prominent young poets, etc.? Anything you can...
kind of thing, I always say I'm the last person to ask what's happening now in American poetry. No, I don't pay attention to that. My job is to concentrate on doing something unique. My work is to make something that is special. So I'm much more interested in, I just got a book of poetry, translations. I didn't know that I'd never read poems by Primo Levi before. So I'll read that. Or I'll pick up Emily Dickinson and I'll find an Emily Dickinson poem I never read before. So I hate to, I don't really want to disappoint you, Alex. And I do teach young poets. And I have these 8 terrific people. Some of them published books already. They're wonderful. And I can tell you that they are very interested in mixed cultures. They're very interested in impurities, how nothing is only one thing. It has to do with other things. And that's reflected in their aesthetic. But I'm mostly, I think my job is to ignore trends and what groups of people are doing. I never knew what a school of poets was. I think more about, can I do something as different from what was before, as William Blake did, or as H.D. and William Carlos Williams did. So I don't want to be perverse and ignore the question, but what's going on in American poetry today is an academic specialist question. It's not a question for me. I'm trying to make unique works of art.
That was a cool answer.
Thank you.
Can I ask you something? In your acknowledgements, I've seen that you are mentioning, you mentioned the Louise Gluck, the Nobel Prize. Can you tell us something about her and you as poets? Do you have any dialogue?
We're close friends. Louise at the moment, though she's in San Francisco, in Berkeley, and I'm here, she's helped me a lot with my literal prose biography that's coming out in 2022. And Louise, I'm not apologizing to Alex, but I want to assure Alex, I take it as a serious question. Louise is another example. Like me, she has judged contests. She was editor of the Yale Younger Poets for a while. You can't afford to pay too much attention to trends. And Louise, too, she's not a member of a school. She has a new book of poems coming out next year. You know, Louise and I are getting on in years, and this new book is very unified. The poems take place in, is it a community of old people? Is it some kind of institution? No, but it's this world, and it is a Louise Gluck world.
Mm-hmm.
It is not related to anything. I mean, it probably is related to things other people are doing, but the first thing you feel is the freshness of it, the uniqueness of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I also have a question.
Ayelet Friedland, I can read your
Yes.
name.
So I have a question about Judaism and Americanism. So I come from an American family, and I feel like Judaism is something that puts you behind a wall, or that's how they felt that it was like, that they're first Jews and then they're Americans. And it's very interesting to see in your poetry that it's very much American, even like in the last poem you just read. And I was wondering about your feelings towards that, and how you hold both things and exist in both places.
It's so exciting. It's a wonderful assignment to be given by history, is to combine this Jewish tradition and the American tradition. And the passage I read about the prairie, I don't know anything about prairies. I have not had much direct, I've driven across them, I've walked around in them, but I read Willa Cather to learn something about prairies. And in the book, I'm speaking to a child, to my daughter, about our country. And I'm trying to be true both to my love for cities and groups and all the different kinds of American music and American jazz, which is largely African, but also Caribbean and European, and it's a mixing. And there's the genius of improvisation and mixing that's an old Jewish tradition, and then it meets this new one that is an American, a tradition of not thinking about traditions in some one unified way. And somebody's joke about Jews is, maybe it's mine, that every Jewish person thinks that there are two other groups of Jews, the ones who are ridiculously not Jewish enough and the others who are ridiculously too Jewish. And I'm in the sweet spot in the middle. And that is a universal on the spectrum. That is a thing that unifies Jews, is that each of them thinks some people are way too Jewish, others are not. Oh, you only have one refrigerator and you pretend to be kosher. And for other people, oh, you have this ancient dietary thing. It's a misinterpretation of a passage in Deuteronomy, blah, 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 blah. And for me, the impurity of it is a thrilling, wonderful opportunity for an artist to be some of everything. So where from in America?
Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens.
Yes, a traditional place where a lot of Jewish families started. The mine, in fact, didn't. And now such a fashionable place. My mother was born in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Wow. It's very unique, I feel.
Her father, well, it's another, I'll tell a Jewish story, a bit of history. The wealthy German Jewish families of New York, I guess they were Brandeises, probably Emma Lazarus's family. They wanted to do something for their Eastern cousins who were coming in at the beginning of the century in great waves. They wanted to help them. There were maybe too many of them. And they talked funny, they smelled funny. And there's a rabbi in Houston who said, we actually could use some more Jews here. So those families paid for ships. It's called the Houston Project. There are books about this. And my grandfather, Morris Eisenberg, was one of the people who rode on that ship as 14 years old and landed in Galveston in 1908. And then he actually met a married woman in Little Rock and took her away from her husband. And that was my grandma and grandpa. And this is
a good story.
A story I'm proud of, so I tell it to
I feel like it's you take great freedom in just calling yourself what you want to be, and like what you said about the prairies, that you've never roamed them, you've drove through them. Like I truly like understand what you mean about belonging to something just because you choose to.
I said recently in this biography, I said, I understand people who there's something to the idea of cultural appropriation on the one hand, or are you letting the English language colonize you? You're Jewish, you're colonizing yourself. And I reject that idea of I'm being colonized by Christian culture. I reject the idea that I'm appropriating it. And I said, if I had to, I would rather plead breaking and entering.
Wow, these are beautiful
Thank
words.
you.
Maybe it's the right time to read a new poem and to conclude this beautiful meeting.
Being a ghost. Being a ghost. When they die, I become a ghost, afloat from room to room, as vague in grief as when I can't find my keys. Some say zombies became popular when phones got so smart we began to stagger, staring at them, entranced. Alone, without my dead to phone, I'm left adrift, as when I can't remember a name I know. Shadowy, appalled ghost mind, aghast at the crowd of names, stranded alive, ashore, out waiting my shadowy boat.
להיות רוח רפאים. כאשר הם מתים אני נהפך לרוח. אני צף ערפילי מחדר לחדר בצער, הדומה לרגעים בהם איני מוצא את מפתחותיי. יש אומרים שזומבים נעשו פופולריים, כאשר טלפונים נעשו כה חכמים. התחלנו לבהות ולנעוץ מבטים לעברם, מחושפים, לבד, ללא מתי לטלפן אליהם, נותרתי עובד עצות כמו בשעה שאיני יכול להיזכר בשם שאני יודע. צללים נחרדו נבעטו מצורת חשיבה של רוח רפאים, בקהל השמות שננטשו חיים. החוף מחכה לסירת הצללים שלי. You wrote it recently.
Yes, this is a recent poem.
Yeah.
My dear friend, the poet C.K. Williams died. Some other people close to me died. And it came to me as the line I just thought, they die, I become a ghost. You know, I'm less myself because I can't call up Charlie Williams and see if I can make him laugh. I'm more alone, and I have many of the attributes of a ghost. I float around the house. I practically say, woo, woo, though not quite. So it was a poem of grief, and it really is just those, what are they, 12 lines, trying to understand the truth of when they die, I become a ghost.
That's interesting, like the opposite.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is time for us to end the meeting. Thank you so much to Mr. Robert Pinsky for being with us. It was a great pleasure. Thank you to Hava Pinhas-Cohen, the translator, for her beautiful translations. Tomorrow we'll be here again with Machi Tawara, Rim Batal, and Chris Abani. You're all welcome to join, and have a great night.
תודה רבה. תודה רבה על האפשרות הזאת. Thank you for this opportunity to meet again Robert Pinsky and to read his poems. And thank you מקום לשירה, and thank you גלעד and נועה, עטרה ואיילת. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, Hava Pinhas-Cohen, so much.
Thank you very much, and חג שמח.
חג שמח, פסח שמח.
פסח שמח.